So after reviewing hundreds and hundreds of capabilities decks, I've come to the conclusion that most of them are a mess. They're overloaded with weak slides and filled with things that no prospect wants to see. So in this video, I'm breaking down the slides that I see in capabilities decks every week, the ones that stall momentum, kill deals, and quietly have your prospects zoning out. I'll show you which slides you should cut, which ones you should keep, and which ones need to be prioritized. But a little bit about me. My name is Lindsay Christian, and I run a six-figure agency dedicated exclusively to creating capabilities decks that close deals. I've designed hundreds and hundreds of decks for some of the biggest brands and names in the world. And now I help agencies of all sizes land their dream clients by talking about the one part of the sales process that I feel like no one's talking about: capabilities decks. So let's trim the fat and close more deals. And be sure to stick around until the end of this video because I'm going to talk about the #1 most controversial slide in capabilities decks and whether you should keep it or cut it. So let's start with what to cut. #1 on the list is portfolio slides. These are slides that show your work across a number of different clients all on one page. So for example, if you do logos, this page might have a bunch of different logos that you designed for different clients. And it's actually more compelling to show what you did for a specific client and the transformation you were able to get for them specifically on one page as a case study, as opposed to having portfolio slides that show all of your work of one type page after page. So a lot of times I'll see agencies, maybe they design logos, so they'll have a page of logos, and then they design websites, so they'll have a page of websites. It's actually, like I said, more compelling to say, okay, take client A. Maybe you did a logo for them, a website for them, and their brand guidelines for them. So put snippets and snapshots of those three things on that case study page for that client and speak a little bit more about the transformation you were able to get for that client based on the work you did. And I'll talk about a great structure for case studies a little bit later in this video, but it's important to understand the difference between portfolio slides and a case study slide, where a case study slide is really focused on the transformation and the results versus just the work that you did. And so the next slide to cut is service lists, any slides that have a ton of services that look like menus, where prospects are basically looking through long lists of the services you offer and are kind of being expected to a la carte select the different services they might want to hire you for. I understand why agencies do this. Maybe they offer a ton of different services, but it's actually more compelling and it's going to be an easier sale if you reduce the number of options down for the prospect that's looking. So for example, instead of having 30 services, I would reduce them down to the core 6 overarching services that a client might want to hire you for. And then as you're kind of talking to them, showing them case studies and the work you do, they'll understand that maybe they're kind of sub-services that fall under those core 6, but it's going to be way more digestible for the prospect if you're limiting the number of options that they're seeing in your capabilities deck. And I will say it's really important to be thoughtful about what those core, 4 to 6 services are. In theory, you're trying to guide the prospect towards, hiring you for the services that you're best at, and ideally the ones that are the most profitable for your agency. So I would take some time in determining what those services are. The fewer the better, less is more on this page. If you have 1 to 2 core services, that's going to be a lot easier for a prospect to digest than if you have, even 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and above. So just think thoughtfully about what you're really great at, what your agency really specializes in. And those are the services that you should really be focusing on in your capabilities deck. So the next slide I would cut is team bios. And I understand the motivation for wanting to include as much information as possible about your team. And if you check out other videos on my channel, I talk a lot about the team slide and where you should place it in the deck. I will actually link to a video at the end of this one that's a slide-by-slide breakdown, so slide by slide how you should structure your deck and where that team slide kind of falls into the grand scheme of things. But ultimately, you don't want to include a ton of slides about your team and really start extending the length of your capabilities deck with team slides. Now, if you want to include a slide with a founder bio, I think that works in some cases, especially if, the background of the founder is really important and can help move the sale forward. Maybe they have core expertise that differentiate your agency in the work you do. So I think that that's fine in most cases. But what you don't want to do is start to really bog down the prospect with a ton of slides that have bios, because the reality is that most prospects aren't going to read those. It's much more compelling to maybe include, the headshots of your team, their name and their role, and then link out to their bio wherever it lives on your website. So that gives the prospect an opportunity to click and learn more if they do want to read more in depth about your team, but you're not extending the length of the capabilities deck and kind of bogging down pages with a lot of heavy text, which is typically what happens when you include bios. So now that I've talked about some of the slides I see that you can definitely cut, let's talk about some of the ones that you should keep and even prioritize in your capabilities capabilities deck. So the first slide I like to keep and prioritize is your logo quilt slide. This slide is a huge trust builder. If you've worked with credible brands, show it. A well-designed, clean logo quilt builds social proof without a single word because humans trust visuals more than they trust copy. So as soon as they see that visual of all the logos of the brands that you've worked with, you're automatically building trust and credibility. Imagine a prospect looking down and seeing a ton of logos for brands that they recognize and that you've done great work for those brands. It's just immediately going to build that trust, and it's going to help them feel more comfortable so that the sale can move forward more seamlessly. And just a quick pro tip, you always want to prioritize the most recognizable logos on your logo quilt. So they should live primarily in the top row and then down either the left or right side. This is where your eyes are drawn to when you look at a logo quilt. So just make sure the biggest brands that you've worked with are falling in those spaces in the logo quilt. And so the next slide to prioritize in your capabilities deck is your differentiator slide. I like to call this the why us slide. This is a slide that really can make or break your capabilities deck. And if you've checked other videos on my channel, I say this is single-handedly the number one most important slide in your deck because it answers the question, why should a prospect hire your agency over any other agency that offers the same services that you do? Now, I see tons of agencies miss an opportunity here. They either don't include this slide or it's super generic with copy like, we're strategic partners, it will help you grow. Nothing on the slide that really differentiates them from one agency to another. So as I mentioned, at the end of this video, I'll link to another video I did that breaks down slide by slide how you should structure your capabilities deck and what should go on each slide. And it talks a lot more in depth about what to put on this slide. But just know that this is a deal breaker for your deck and it's super important and should be prioritized. I typically like to include it within the first 10 pages in the deck. And just a pro tip again with this slide, if everything on this slide could be applied to any other agency in the world, then it's not a differentiator slide. What you're listing on this slide should be very specific to your agency. So for example, I just created this mock slide for an agency that does underwater content, videography, photography. So if you look at the copy on this slide, it's very, very specific to them. You know, we capture the depths in a way no one else can. So right off the bat, they're saying we're unlike any other agency that captures this type of content. And then they're hitting hard with bold text and big headlines that really drive home their differentiators. So for example, underwater is our only focus. Marine experts, visual masters. Every ocean, we've navigated it all. So essentially, they're talking about underwater is their only focus, which is then differentiating them from content agencies that maybe do other types of content or aren't specifically focused on capturing underwater photography and videography. And then when they're talking about marine experts and visual masters, they're saying that their team is built of people that know water, know underwater, and have lived that life. So again, that's a big differentiator from other agencies, which might just have, you know, regular videographers or photographers or content creators that don't specialize in capturing underwater content. And then every ocean, we've navigated it all. So then tapping into their expertise across all of the different oceans, all the different bodies of water, they've seen it all, they've been there. And so that's kind of putting their expertise front and center, which when put up against other agencies that might do this type of work, they look like the expert in the field, they look like the most experienced, and they look like the go-to. So just really think through this slide. Again, at the end of this video, I'll link up to another video that goes into way more depth on what to put on this slide and how to think about what you should put on it. But it's super important to think about the differentiators for your agency because this can really make or break your capabilities deck and your ability to close clients. And finally, another slide I really think you should keep, focus on, and prioritize is case study slides. This is where you can start to stack your proof and really prove to prospects that you can get results by showing them what you've done for the clients you've worked with. A lot of agencies are more so creating portfolio slides where they're showing, you know, their work by type. So all logos, all websites, all press hits, grouping the work by type versus focusing on each client and holistically the work they did for that client and the transformation they were able to get for that client. So again, showing holistically what you did for a client is going to be much more compelling to a prospect because it allows them to see, okay, they were able to do that for them. Now they can do that for me. And so I typically stick to a very streamlined way to create case studies so that it's very clear what the impact was, what the results were, and what the transformation was for the client. And so I'll go through it right now. So it includes a headline that highlights the transformation, results that show the impact, a challenge, so explain the problem that your client was facing, Then I like to include our role, which basically talks about your role as the agency and what you did to solve that problem. And finally, I like to include a testimonial from that client right on the page. So sometimes getting a testimonial might not be doable. You might not have one from every client, but if you can get a testimonial, putting it right on the case study page will really level up the power of that case study and just make it more compelling for prospects because it's humanizing the case study and they're able to see, a human being that hired you praising your work. And that just builds even more credibility and trust with the prospect that you're pitching. So this is just a case study I created for our underwater content agency. And again, this follows the format that I just went through. So for example, a headline: from service level content to global conservation icon, how coral guardians went viral and helped save a reef. So this is just packing a punch right from the start. This is going to allow the prospect to see exactly what you did for them and what the outcome really was for their business and to get excited about the type of results you can get for them. And then next on the page that draws their eye are the big bold results. So 54.2 million global views, 270% increase in donations, and then some of the bigger media outlets that featured the brand. So again, you want to draw the eyes of the prospect to those results. You don't want them to have to read the fine print or look through paragraphs to figure out what the key metrics and results were that you got for the client. You just want them big and bold on the page. And then next, it talks about the challenge. So again, the problem that the client was facing, then our role section, which is what the agency did to solve that problem. And then finally, the testimonial right there on the page. I like to include a headshot, the name of the person, and their title. So again, this is just humanizing the case study. The prospects looking at this page, they're seeing a real person. This is what they look like. This is their name. This is their role. Maybe they even identify with that role, and they're seeing these words of praise directly connected back to the work that was executed for them. So that really just levels up every case study. And as I mentioned, I always recommend, if you can, get a testimonial and put it right on the case study page for each client. And this is just a pro tip. You should always prioritize trying to create case studies for the most recognizable brands on your logo quilt. So for example, if you did work for Nike, it would be great to create a case study for the work that you did for Nike because the prospect is seeing a brand they recognize. They're going to be excited by that, intrigued by that, and they're going to want to know what work did you do for that brand that they recognize. So it's not always possible. A lot of agencies I know are under NDAs or can't share certain work with certain clients, but if you can, try to prioritize creating case studies for the biggest, most recognizable brands on your logo quilt. Because again, that just levels up the credibility of your deck overall of the work that you're doing and will get the prospect really excited about, wanting to work with you because you've worked with these other reputable brands. So as promised, let's get to the most controversial slide in a capabilities deck, and that's the pricing slide. Some agencies swear by it. Others think that it kills deals. I think it can go either way depending on what your goals are, the types of prospects that you're pitching, and what you ultimately want to accomplish in the pitching process. So it really depends on how you sell. I would include a pricing slide if, for example, you want to pre-qualify leads based on price in the pitching process. Another reason to include it would be if you offer productized or tiered services where the pricing is already out there, maybe on your website. And another time that I like to use a pricing slide is if you're more so pitching hot leads, so people that were referred into you where that trust and credibility is kind of already there, and it's really more about getting to the bottom line of whether you can work together. Price is obviously going to be a big piece of that. So I think you're okay to use a pricing slide in those situations. So when I wouldn't use it is if you're testing pricing, if you typically do custom pricing for your clients, or if you're more so pitching cold leads. So cold traffic, people that don't know anything about your agency, they're just learning that you exist, they're just learning about your services. That's probably too early to bring in price. And again, pricing is something that you can create a standalone slide for. You can bring it in at any point in the pitching process. So I definitely don't think it needs to be in your deck at all, but it's a slide that's controversial that can really help or hurt the sale depending on how you sell, where you are in the pitching process, and again, how early you bring it in. So the bottom line, if you think the pricing slide is going to move the right people forward faster, then I would use it. But if it's going to create more confusion than clarity, I would leave it out. So there you have it. A few quick tips about which slides to cut, which ones to keep, and which ones to prioritize to ensure that your capabilities deck is moving your prospects closer to the sale. And if you want an even more detailed guide about how to structure your deck, slide by slide, check out this video. It goes into pitching strategy, slide order, and how to optimize each page in your deck to make sure that you're packing the maximum punch.